They say one never notices the moment of transformation. The line between what you were and what you have become blurs like blood in water. I remember when my hands were still human. I was once Kael'vor, planetary governor of Marinus for a world of reasonable prosperity and unremarkable loyalty. The administratum reports had always marked us as compliant. Our tithes were paid with minimal delay. Our recruitment quotas were met without complaint. Generations of my family had governed with quiet competence. None among us had ever sought glory. We simply existed in service to the Golden Throne. None would have predicted my fall. I certainly did not. The first corruption is so subtle that you welcome it as clarity. It began during the Festival of Compliance, a drab ceremonial week, where we celebrated 5 centuries of unbroken imperial rule. The skies were overcast that season, endless clouds of gray that seemed to press down upon the spires of our modest hive city. I stood upon the balcony of the gubernatorial palace, looking out at the masses gathered below, their faces turned upward in mindless devotion. The sight should have filled me with pride. Instead, I felt nothing but contempt. How many generations had we spent in servitude to a corpse god who offered nothing in return? How many of our sons and daughters had been fed into the meat grinder of imperial wars, fought on distant worlds for reasons none could articulate? The questions came unbidden, thoughts I had never before allowed myself to entertain. Yet there they were, sudden and insistent, like a wound that had always existed beneath my skin, but only now began to bleed. That night, I could not sleep. My mind raced with possibilities I had never considered. Visions of a different world, a different future plagued me. In the darkness of my chambers, I heard a voice, soft at first, barely distinguishable from my own thoughts. It spoke of potential, of power waiting to be claimed, of freedom from the crushing weight of imperial rule. I told no one of these thoughts. In the following days, I performed my duties as expected. I reviewed production reports, authorized resource allocations, and presided over minor legal disputes. But beneath the surface, something had changed. I began to see the flaws in the system I had served for so long. The inefficiency, the waste, the cruelty masquerading as necessity. The voice grew stronger. It spoke of ancient powers that existed before the Imperium, before the Emperor. Gods who rewarded ambition rather than blind obedience. Gods who saw potential in men like me. I did not immediately succumb. For months, I resisted, clinging to the beliefs that had defined my life. I increased my attendance at imperial services. I commissioned a new statue of the Emperor for the central plaza. I ordered public executions of suspected heretics, watching their bodies burn with an intensity that disturbed even my most zealous advisors. But resistance only made the voice stronger. It began to show me things, visions that came when I closed my eyes. I saw myself leading armies across the stars. I saw my name spoken with reverence and fear. I saw power beyond anything the Imperium could offer. The change was gradual enough that I could pretend it was not happening. Small compromises, minor indulgences, a blind eye turned to certain activities within my domain. Private investigations into ancient texts that should have been destroyed. Secret communications with individuals whose names never appeared in official records. The first physical manifestation of my corruption appeared on the night of the winter solstice. I awoke from troubled dreams to find a small mark upon my chest directly above my heart. A simple spiral no larger than a coin that seemed to have been burned into my flesh. Yet there was no pain, no inflammation. It looked as though it had always been there, a natural part of me finally revealing itself. I should have been horrified. I should have reported myself to the ecclesiarchy immediately. Instead, I felt a surge of pride. The mark was confirmation that I had been chosen, that I was special, that my destiny extended beyond the limited horizons of imperial service. The voice had a name now. It called itself Exopen, an emissary of the Changer of Ways. It promised knowledge and power in exchange for service, not blind obedience, but partnership, a covenant between beings of mutual ambition. My fall accelerated after that night. I began to make subtle changes to the governance of Marinus Fourth. Resources were diverted from imperial projects to initiatives of my own design. Certain industries were prioritized over others. Specific individuals were elevated to positions of influence, people who shared my growing dissatisfaction with imperial rule. None recognized these changes for what they were. The bureaucracy of the Imperium is so vast, so labyrinthine, that adjustments can be hidden within the endless flow of data and documentation. By the time anyone might have noticed, it would be too late. The mark above my heart grew slowly, the spiral extending tendrils across my chest like roots seeking soil. Other changes followed. My dreams became more vivid, filled with symbols and geometries that should not exist in three-dimensional space. I found myself understanding concepts that had previously seemed impenetrable. The underlying patterns of reality began to reveal themselves to me, like a complex mechanism suddenly rendered transparent. My first true act of heresy came almost a year after the initial corruption. A delegation from the Adeptus Mechanicus had arrived to conduct a standard assessment of our industrial capacity. Among them was a tech priest named Magos Drenv, a spindly figure more machine than man, whose augment eyes seemed to pierce through the carefully constructed facade of my continued loyalty. During a private audience, he confronted me directly. "Your data submissions contain anomalies, Governor VOR," he said, his voice a metallic rasp, "production variances that cannot be explained by standard deviation parameters, resource allocations that contradict optimal efficiency matrices." In that moment, I knew I had a choice. I could retreat, manufacture explanations, and delay the inevitable discovery of my activities. Or I could take the first irreversible step down the path that had been revealed to me. I chose the latter. What happened in that room is something I have never spoken of to anyone. The memories are fragmented, like shards of a broken mirror. I remember Zaphin's voice, stronger than ever, guiding my words and actions. I remember symbols appearing in the air between myself and the Margos, glowing sigils that burned themselves into reality. I remember the tech priest's augment eyes widening in recognition, then fear, then something like rapture. When the audience concluded, Margot Renoviv left my chambers, a changed being. The delegation departed 2 days later, their assessment complete. Their report to Mars would contain no mention of anomalies or irregularities. Instead, it would praise the exceptional efficiency and productivity of Marinus IV, recommending our methodologies be studied and perhaps implemented elsewhere. I had my first ally in what would become my inner circle. Over the following months, others would join. Some were corrupted, as Dren had been. Others came willingly, drawn by ambition or dissatisfaction or simple curiosity. A network formed beneath the surface of imperial governance. A shadow hierarchy devoted to the changer of ways. The mark continued to spread across my body, spirals and halls of discolored flesh that I concealed beneath increasingly elaborate gubernatorial robes. My dreams were now dominated by visions of a vast library, where every possible future was catalogued and accessible to those with the knowledge to navigate its impossible architecture. Sometimes I would awake to find that I had filled pages with writings in languages I had never studied, complex theorems that redefined the fundamental nature of reality. As my power grew, so too did my caution. I knew the consequences of discovery. The Imperium does not forgive heresy, especially among those entrusted with authority. Detection would mean not just my death, but the death of millions as punishment for allowing corruption to take root. Entire hive blocks would be purged. Perhaps the entire planet would be cleansed with fire. The irony did not escape me. The very system I was betraying had instilled in me the discipline and attention to detail that now protected my betrayal. The skills that had made me an effective servant of the Imperium now made me an effective agent of its enemies. 2 years passed. My transformation continued, both physical and mental. The changes to my body could no longer be completely hidden. I began to withdraw from public appearances, citing health concerns. My communications were increasingly conducted through intermediaries. Rumors spread among the population. Some said I was dying. Others claimed I had already died and been replaced by a double. None suspected the truth. In private, I reveled in my metamorphosis. The spiral patterns had spread to cover most of my torso and were beginning to extend down my arms and legs. My eyes had changed, the irises shifting from brown to a luminous amber that seemed to contain infinite depth. My mental capabilities had expanded beyond anything I could have imagined in my former life. I could perceive patterns in the flow of time itself, glimpsing potential futures and selecting the paths most advantageous to my designs. Zaphen was no longer a voice, separate from my own thoughts. We had become something closer to a single entity. The distinction between his will and mine had blurred, just as the line between my human form and something other had begun to fade. It was during this period that I first heard whispers of the Ordo Hereticus. Nothing concrete, nothing that would indicate direct investigation, but enough to create concern. Agents of the Inquisition had been observed in neighboring systems, conducting what were described as routine evaluations. But there is no such thing as a routine evaluation when it comes to the Inquisition. I accelerated my plans. The network I had built now extended beyond Marinesfer, reaching into adjacent systems through trade agreements, diplomatic channels, and carefully cultivated personal relationships. Cells of devotees waited for my signal, prepared to take action when the moment arrived. That moment came sooner than expected. A strike cruiser of the Imperial Navy entered orbit without warning or explanation. Standard protocol required immediate communication and clarification of purpose. None was forthcoming. Instead, 3 Thunderhawk gunships detached from the cruiser and began descent toward the capital. I knew then that we had been discovered, or at least suspected. There would be no more time for subtle manipulation. The conflict would now be open and direct. What followed was the first Battle of Marinus, though Imperial records would later deny it ever occurred. The forces at my disposal were initially modest, consisting primarily of the Planetary Defense Force, supplemented by certain elements of the local Adeptus Mechanicus, who had joined my cause. Against us stood a company of Imperial Fist Space Marines, among the most formidable warriors in the Imperium. By all rational assessment, we should have been annihilated within hours. The Space Marines were not only superior in terms of combat capability, but also operated with absolute moral certainty. They were the Emperor's finest, genetically engineered for warfare and indoctrinated to know no fear. Yet, we prevailed, not through conventional military strategy, but through means that defied conventional understanding. As the Imperial forces advanced through the capital, reality itself seemed to warp around them. Buildings that had stood for centuries suddenly contained corridors that looped back on themselves or led to chambers that should not have existed. Communications failed in patterns that could not be explained by standard interference. Sensorium readings showed multiple versions of the same targets appearing simultaneously in different locations. I directed these effects from the depths of the gubernatorial palace, drawing upon powers that even I did not fully comprehend. The mark upon my body burned with cold fire as I shaped the underlying fabric of our reality. Guided by Zaffin's knowledge and my own burgeoning abilities, the Space Marines fought with characteristic determination and discipline. They adapted to the impossible geometries and chronological anomalies as best they could. They maintained unit cohesion even as the very concept of spatial relationships became increasingly malleable. They pressed forward toward their objective, suffering losses but never wavering. In the end, it was not victory in the traditional sense that we achieved, but rather a stalemate that served our purposes. After 3 days of impossible conflict, the Imperial forces withdrew to orbit. The strike cruiser departed the system shortly thereafter, presumably to report what they had encountered and request reinforcements. I knew we had gained only a temporary reprieve. The Imperium would return in greater numbers with specific countermeasures for the phenomena they had witnessed. We needed to be gone before that happened. The evacuation began immediately. Not a panicked exodus, but a carefully orchestrated migration. Selected individuals and resources were prioritized. The rest would be left behind, both to maintain the appearance of normalcy and to serve as a distraction when the hammer of Imperial retribution eventually fell. My inner circle, and I departed Marinus 4 aboard a modified bulk freighter whose cargo holds had been converted to accommodate our specific needs. Marostrenv had overseen the modifications personally, incorporating technologies that would have earned him immediate execution had they been discovered by his former colleagues in the Mechanicus. As we broke orbit, I stood in the observation dome, watching as the world of my birth receded into the distance. The spiral patterns on my skin pulsed with energy, synchronizing with the rhythm of the warp drives as they prepared to tear a hole in reality and propel us into the immaterium. I felt nothing resembling regret or nostalgia. Those emotions belonged to KLVOR, planetary governor of Minas 4. That man no longer existed. In his place stood someone, something else, a being in transition, a vessel for powers beyond mortal comprehension. As the warp engines engaged, and reality distorted around our vessel, I embraced the next phase of my transformation. The Imperium had taught me discipline, administration, and the management of power. Now those skills would serve a different master, a god of change and possibility, whose designs transcended the limited imagination of the Corpse Emperor. Our destination lay in the region known as the Halo Stars, a mysterious and largely uncharted area at the fringe of the galaxy. There, beyond the reach of Imperial authority, we would establish a new power base. From there, my influence would spread back toward the heart of the Imperium, subtle and patient, like the spiral patterns that had come to define my existence. The journey through the warp was unlike any standard transit. Where most Imperial vessels required Gela fields to create a bubble of real space, protecting them from the horrors of the immaterium, our ship embraced those same energies. We traveled not in defiance of the warp, but in harmony with it. The effects were both terrifying and exhilarating. Time lost all meaning. Moments stretched into what felt like centuries, then compressed back into the ram dust, microsecond signs. The boundaries between individual consciousness began to blur. Thoughts became visible, manifesting as colorful patterns that drifted through the corridors of the ship. Dreams escaped from sleeping minds to intermingle with waking reality. Throughout this impossible journey, I continued to change. The spiral patterns completed their coverage of my body. My skin now an intricate canvas of holes and curves that seemed to move subtly when not directly observed. My voice acquired harmonic overtones that could not be produced by a human larynx. Most significantly, my perception expanded beyond the limitations of physical senses. I began to see the ship not merely as a vessel of metal and energy, but as a node within the greater pattern of the universe. I could trace the connections between our current position and all potential destinations. I could perceive the gossamer threads of causality that bound past to present to future. This expanded awareness came with a price. The more I perceived, the less human I became. Memories of my former life began to fade or transform. Did I truly remember the face of my father? Or was the image in my mind a construction based on what a father should look like? Had I ever actually walked the gardens of the gubernatorial palace? Or were those recollections implanted to create the illusion of a consistent past? Identity itself became fluid, a construct to be shaped rather than an immutable foundation. I was Kael'vor, but I was also becoming something else, something without name or precedent. The boundaries that separated me from Zaphen, from the warp itself, grew increasingly permeable. Our arrival in the halo stars marked the beginning of the next phase. The system we chose had no official designation in imperial records, merely a numerical classification in ancient navigational charts. The primary planet was technically habitable, though no human colony had ever been established there. The surface was predominantly covered by a shallow ocean of heavy metals in liquid form, with islands of crystalline formations that reached toward a sky perpetually veiled in aurora-like phenomena. It was perfect for our purposes. The unusual electromagnetic properties of the environment would mask our presence from standard imperial scanning. The liquid metal oceans could be harvested for raw materials. The isolation would give us time to build and prepare. We established our first settlement on the largest of the crystalline islands, creating structures that melded technology with organic forms in ways that would have horrified orthodox members of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Magos Drenv oversaw the construction, his own form now as altered as my own. Mechondrites that had once been purely functional appendages had transformed into sinuous tentacles that constantly rearranged themselves into complex mathematical expressions. His augmentatic eyes had multiplied, covering his head in a crown of lenses that each perceived a different spectrum of reality. As our new domain took shape, others began to arrive. Word of our enclave spread through channels invisible to imperial authorities, but well known to those who sought alternatives to the crushing orthodoxy of the throne. Renegade tech priests brought knowledge and rare technologies. Disillusioned imperial officers brought military expertise, and occasionally entire crews or units who had turned from their oaths. Scholars and psychers who had glimpsed the truth behind the imperial creed came seeking confirmation and community. Not all were welcomed. I had learned the value of selectivity during my time as governor. Quality mattered more than quantity. Each potential addition to our growing society was evaluated not merely for their immediate utility, but for their alignment with the broader pattern we sought to create. Some came seeking only power or refuge from imperial justice. These were useful in their way, but kept at the periphery of our organization. Others came with genuine devotion to the changer of ways, having independently discovered the truths that had been revealed to me. These became our inner cadre, entrusted with knowledge and authority proportionate to their understanding. 5 years passed according to standard imperial chronology. Though subjective time within our enclave flowed differently, our numbers grew to several thousand. Our technological capabilities expanded beyond anything available to all but the highest echelons of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Our understanding of the warp and its relationship to real space deepened through constant study and experimentation. Throughout this period of growth, my transformation continued. The final vestiges of my human appearance fell away. My height increased until I towered over even the augmented forms of our tech priests. My flesh became something other than flesh, a substance that maintained consistent form only through conscious effort. My voice could now alter the thoughts of those who heard it, planting suggestions that took root and flourished in the fertile soil of receptive minds. Yet these physical changes were merely the visible manifestation of a more profound metamorphosis. My consciousness expanded beyond the limitations of linear time. I could perceive multiple potential futures simultaneously, evaluating probabilities and adjusting our course to maximize desirable outcomes. I could reach into the minds of our followers across vast distances, guiding and instructing without the need for conventional communication. With these abilities came new challenges. The more my perception expanded, the more difficult it became to focus on any single point in time or space. The endless branching of potential futures created a labyrinth of possibility in which I sometimes lost myself for subjective weeks, only to return to find that mere moments had passed in real space. Zaphin's presence within me evolved as well. No longer a distinct voice or personality, he had become more like a current of power that flowed through the expanding ocean of my consciousness. At times, I was aware of his guidance, particularly when interfacing with the deeper mysteries of the warp. At other times, the distinction between his will and mine disappeared entirely. As my power grew, so too did my awareness of other powers that moved within the Imperium. The changer of ways was but one of the great entities that humans in their limited understanding refer to as the Chaos Gods. I sensed the presence of the others, the Blood God, the Lord of Decay, and the Prince of Excess. Each represented a fundamental aspect of existence,